finally here, Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3, the climactic conclusion to the Tenkaichi trilogy developed by Spike and published by Namco Bandai in PAL regions and Atari in the US. Just like its predecessor, Tenkaichi 3 released both on the Sony PlayStation 2 and on the Nintendo Wii, and its release to the market was all over the place. For some reason, it hit both consoles in Japan on October 4th, 2007, then the PS2 version came to the US on November 13th, but the Wii version didn't show up until December 3rd. And then Europe got the PS2 version on November 9th, but didn't get the Wii port until February 15th, 2008. I'm confident this was just localization issues, but it's interesting how staggered these releases are. Of course, Budokai Tenkaichi 3 was just its Western name. The original name for the game is Dragon Ball Z Sparking Meteor, because, of course, this is another entry into the Sparking series. I'm playing the PS2 version here, which, as you can see, is fantastic. Budokai Tenkaichi 2 felt like it was just a bigger version of Tenkaichi 1, but Tenkaichi 3 feels like a genuinely improved game with a bunch of new mechanics and ideas to fully flesh out the potential of the series. Some for better, others maybe for worse. Everything on offer here feels dialed in to create the most fleshed out Dragon Ball Z experience possible, especially on the PS2, which at this point was starting to feel like an outdated console thanks to the release of the Sony PlayStation 3 roughly a year before. Spike was really trying to deliver a climactic resolution to their tenure on the PS2. So let's start by checking out the new story mode available in Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3. Dragon History is Budokai Tenkaichi 3's story mode, offering players a new way to experience various different highlights from the Dragon Ball Z series, including the stories from most of the films and even the GT and original Dragon Ball series. The first thing to note is that this mode is significantly reduced in size and scale. We're back to a menu screen selection process similar to the first Tenkaichi game, and they've totally done away with the free roam exploration aspects as well. So there's no flying around or collecting characters or anything like that. It's all just menus, and I know this might not be a popular opinion, but I kind of feel like this was the right call. If they weren't going to, or didn't have the resources to commit to the exploration element in a way that more closely resembled Budokai 3, with more things to do than just fly from point A to point B, then I think just removing the feature outright might have been the right move. Because going back to a menu-centric feature, while less novel, is more efficient and gets you moving between battles a lot faster. I also kind of like how the main anime sagas are each given their own section, while the movie and filler sagas are placed into a separated saga appropriately titled Special Sagas. All of the voice dialogue is still there, but it didn't feel as overbearing this time around, and they did implement it where it doesn't talk as much in between selecting an option and actually going into that option. So that's definitely an improvement. As for the sagas themselves, the amount of available fights has been drastically reduced from the previous game. I talked a lot in my Tenkaichi 2 coverage about just how huge the story mode was and how there were literally over 100 different battles to play through. Well, that's been scaled way back to just a couple dozen across the game's entire story mode. For comparison, completing all of Budokai Tenkaichi 2's story takes upwards of 15 to 20 hours depending on what difficulty you select, versus Budokai Tenkaichi 3, which takes more like 8 to 10. Each saga has been significantly reduced in size, but the individual battles have increased quite a bit in scale. There's a ton of dialogue going on throughout every story match that essentially tells the narrative of whatever battle you're playing, which is a very cool addition. There's a ton of dialogue going out through every match that essentially tells the narrative of whatever battle you're playing, which is a very cool addition and can kind of add a sense of depth to a given battle. A major new addition, however, is that during matches, you'll be prompted once or twice throughout the battle to click down on the right joystick. This prompt is a button to trigger what is, for lack of a better term, a canon event. Some only have one of these prompts, others can have 2 or 3, but clicking it will always either initiate a mini cutscene mid-match that retells a little of the narrative and gets you back into the fight, or play a mini cutscene that ends the fight early with an ultimate finishing move. Which, by the way, highlights another new feature of this game, which is that enemies can straight up dissolve now. I remember thinking about wanting that feature while playing Tenkaichi 2, so there is something super satisfying about hitting an opponent with a massive finisher and then not seeing their character model there after the smoke clears. We saw a few fights in Tenkaichi 2 that featured a tag team mechanic for players to swap out characters throughout a match, but this time that mechanic is put to much better use as nearly every fight has multiple characters swapping in and out of the fight. So even though there's less matches, each match is longer and feels far more intricate thanks to the features I just discussed. Every battle feels so powerful. I feel like they've done a really great job fulfilling that kind of Dragon Ball Z power fantasy here. Probably better than any of the other Dragon Ball games I've talked about so far. I loved how massive Tenkaichi 2 was in a lot of ways, but I did bring up the fact that it started to become fatiguing to get through near the end due to how many fights there were and how similar so many of them felt. I feel this really nails the less is more approach overall. That said, there is less agency on the player's part during these battles, and that isn't really a good thing. Pretty much every fight in the story mode will have the R3 button prompts I mentioned earlier, and a lot of them just kinda do parts of the fight for you, sometimes even just ending the fight outright, with a finisher that knocks 3 or 4 full bars of health from your opponent just because it's scripted. Yes, these events are technically optional, but choosing not to do them means the button prompt never goes away, and it just takes up part of the screen the whole time, not letting me play out the fight how I want, or even leaving it up to me to replicate the events from the anime myself. While this mechanic did make these battles a lot more cinematic, it also made things feel so much more on the rails than past games, resulting in what I think is less replay value overall. There is still something left up to the player to do during matches though, and that's some old-fashioned Dragon Ball hunting. Yeah, Dragon Ball collecting is back again, but unfortunately it hasn't really improved at all besides 2 things, and when juxtaposed against the rest of the game, stands out in a bad way because of it. It's nearly identical to how it functioned in the last 2 games, leaving players to blow up environment pieces mid-match while searching for Dragon Balls, and it didn't end up feeling all that fun and sometimes was just frustrating depending on the difficulty, because some of these enemies can be very aggro and won't give you a moment's rest to find a Dragon Ball. You can actually find Dragon Balls in one of this game's other modes, but it's pretty rare and doesn't really change the fact that this is the main method of Dragon Ball collection. The 2 ways it's improved are this. Oftentimes when hunting for one, simply flying through whatever piece of environment is containing it will auto-collect it rather than having to go pick it up off the ground. And secondly, we get 2 extra dragons available to summon. Of course, we can summon Shenron and make a wish for any one of a few cool things available in the game, but there's also a chance you'll end up summoning Porunga, which means you get 3 wishes instead of just 1. Even better, if you end up beating 100% of the Dragon History mode, you have a chance to summon Red Shenron from the Black Star Dragon Balls as seen in GT. The dragon you summon depends entirely on RNG. Whichever one of the 3 you get is totally up to chance. It's a cool new feature, but maybe not enough to keep the act of hunting the Dragon Balls feeling compelling enough. As for the different sagas available for us to play, it's very similar to what we've seen before, but downscaled quite a bit. You've got the Saiyan saga, of course, but it's trimmed way down to only 3 individual battles. The one against Raditz, where you bounce back and forth between Goku and Piccolo, of course, and the battle against Nappa, which, if I may, has never been done this well. Struggling against Nappa, watching multiple of our heroes as they come in and out of the battle while Nappa continues to stand strong adds a powerful element to the battle. Then, thirdly, we have the iconic first battle between Goku and Vegeta, and I mean, it's awesome. Getting to fight Vegeta in both his Saiyan form and his Ozaru form without having to see a single menu screen, it's just great. Fantastic. After completing the Saiyan saga, we unlock some movie content, which I've already said more than enough how much I enjoy, but I'll talk about the movie stuff in a minute. Let's talk about Frieza instead. Or rather, his saga, which is more dedicated to him alone than I've ever seen in any other game so far. The first battle here is against the Ginyu Force, which the tag team mechanic introduced in the second game and returning here almost feels like it was made for. Fighting through the Ginyu Force is genuinely a lot of fun, and what's way more interesting is that the battle after this has us playing as Frieza against Vegeta, Piccolo, Krillin, and Gohan. This is an interesting method of reintroducing the idea of playing as the major villains like we saw in the first Tenkaichi game, and since it's only in one battle, it feels a lot better than the first game's implementation. And the remaining Frieza Saga battles are showcasing Goku against Frieza. Great execution. There are obviously quite a few battles missing from this, but I'll be honest, with Budokai Tenkaichi 2 existing and covering every fathomable battle from the series short of Spopovich, I think this one can afford to try something more minimal and direct. And besides, the Android 19 fights are here, so I'm not about to complain. And even better, we get the Goku vs 19 fight along with Vegeta vs 19 fight, which, I'll just say it, the Goku 19 fight is one of the most underrated fights of the series. Yeah, it's short, but it's still pretty good. Starting the fight with Goku and finishing it with Vegeta is great. After that, we skip straight to Cell, where we get to play as him, similar to the Frieza situation. Again, just for a single mission, but one that takes us through his fights to achieve his perfect form. Also like the Frieza situation, playing as Cell for this mission is pretty fun. I liked it. The whole Android saga in general is very Cell-centered. Other than the 19 fight, it's pretty much all Cell. I like the Goku Cell fight, and the Gohan vs Cell fight is pulled out across multiple matches, so it's clear the devs were trying to do the iconic battle justice. We also get a battle dedicated to Trunks returning to his timeline and destroying Cell, which is always satisfying to see and makes for a great epilogue to the whole Android/Cell saga. The Buu saga is arguably the most limited of all of them. I can't quite explain what I mean, but like, a lot of battles are missing. We start off with Majin Vegeta vs Goku, which, I mean, of course, it's arguably the best fight of the whole series, and then we get Vegeta vs Fat Buu. If you don't do the R3 prompts, then you can actually play through to a little hidden part of the fight where Babidi flies out and Vegeta gets to fight him, which is actually pretty funny. I can't believe they gave Babidi a character model that's actually fightable in the game. He's even got his own special moves. We then skip all the way straight to Vegeta vs Buhan, which is fine, but that's quite a few battles left out there. No Super Saiyan 3 Goku vs Fat Buu, or Gotenks vs Super Buu, or any of it. Granted, the Vegeta vs Buhan fight does let us fight him as both Goku and Vegeta before they fuse into Vegito. Then it's straight to the final battle against Kid Buu, of which there are several. We do Super Saiyan 3 Goku vs Kid Buu in its own match, then another multi-character match where we swap between base form Goku, then Fat Buu, then Hercule, who is really hard to use in this battle and took me several retries, then Vegeta for a bit, and back to base form Goku again for the final Spirit Bomb. I was kind of feeling like they didn't give the Buu saga as much love as the Android saga personally, but the battles are all pretty long and in-depth, so I can't complain. The game doesn't end there because, of course, we've got all of the movie battles to talk about, the first of which is the fight against Dr. Wheelo. This marks a first so far, as I can't even think of a game that covered this movie before this one did. He's fun to fight too. After I brought up the lack of his character being in Tenkaichi 2, I really wasn't expecting to see him in this one, but here we are. Most of these movie sagas are limited to a single battle, but each battle is pretty lengthy and features tons of dialogue through the match to sort of tell the story of the film and offers multiple characters to swap between during that single match. Other than World's Strongest, the rest are all returning movies we've seen before. We've got Bardock, who gets his own full saga this time, Tree of Might, Lord Slug, both cooler movies, Android 13, the first two Broly movies, Fusion Reborn, and Wrath of the Dragon. It's all here, and it's all very, very similar to what it was like in Budokai Tenkaichi 2. The GT sagas are included again, but feature more content than before thanks to the inclusion of Nova Shenron, which is super cool, but it's too bad they didn't include Ice Shenron since he's the victim of the coolest depiction of Goku's Dragon Fist move that we've ever seen. I cannot believe this move isn't canon. Also, this is the first time we're seeing GT Kid Goku with all three forms seen in the series, from base form to Super Saiyan, then Super Saiyan 3, and of course, Super Saiyan 4, which is now directly accessible from Kid Goku mid-match, rather than being its own character independent of a base form like in Tenkaichi 2. Other than that, the other basics are covered here, like Baby's Saga with all of the relevant transformations, Super 17, which is always fun, and then of course both forms of Omega Shenron and the Shadow Dragon Saga. The only thing I can imagine that could have been added was, since Baby Vegeta is basically just GT Vegeta's character, it could have been cool to make base form GT Vegeta a character in his own right so he could transform into Super Saiyan 4, but that didn't happen. Of course, what ifs are back, but this time most of them are Dragon Ball related, which is good for fans of the OG series. We've got Goku vs Arale, Android 8 vs Android 16, and Devilman vs Mecha Frieza, King Cold, and their minions. The only totally non-Dragon Ball related scenario is a what-if where Bardock, King Vegeta, and Vegeta all teamed up together to fight and destroy Frieza. This is the only time we actually see King Vegeta as a playable character in the game, so that's pretty cool. Speaking of the original Dragon Ball series, it's gotten a lot more love in this game than I think we've really seen in any Dragon Ball Z game prior. Now, I'm not much of an OG series Dragon Ball fan, so in order to do some actual justice to these additions in a meaningful way, I've asked fellow Dragon Ball content creator Hidden to come in and help me out by covering the various original Dragon Ball offerings available here.
One of the standout features of Tenkaichi 3 is how it represents the entire Dragon Ball franchise, for the time anyway. Remember, this was 2007 and Super was years away at this point. Tenkaichi 3 wasn't afraid to include more minor and often forgotten characters. A significant aspect that had been neglected in earlier Dragon Ball Z games was the inclusion of content from the original Dragon Ball arc. In some ways this makes sense, as Dragon Ball was way less action focused than Z, and lore-wise the characters are completely outmatched. But in my opinion, Dragon Ball has some of the best fights in the series, so it's fantastic how much Tenkaichi 3 goes out of its way to feature these characters faithfully, not only by the way they look, but also by the way they fight. One of the most interesting is Spike the Devil Man, who Goku fought against in the Fortune Teller Barber saga. His signature move is the Devil Might Beam, which turns an opponent's own negative thoughts into destructive beams that can annihilate anything in their path. Goku, being pure of heart, is immune to this attack. When using this attack in Tenkaichi 3, just like in the source material, characters with pure hearts are immune to the Devilman's ultimate attack, but for those who are evil, they take a massive amount of damage. Another cool inclusion is a character that we almost never get to play as, and that is Chi-Chi. The only other game that she made a significant appearance that I can think of is Super Dragon Ball Z, and also Dragon Ball Evolution the game, but that wasn't the real Chi-Chi. And also, nobody wants to be reminded of Dragon Ball Evolution. There's this really interesting interaction that you can trigger when GT Goku faces off against Kid Chi-Chi.
Ha! Chi-Chi, you got smaller too! You did something again, didn't you? You troublemaker!
Chi-Chi's dialogue suggests that she is not the kid Chi-Chi from the Dragon Ball arc, but actually the adult Chi-Chi who has been turned back into a kid, like what happened to Goku in Dragon Ball GT, which lines up with how she is unlocked in the game, as you must wish for her from Black Star Shenron. And we can't forget the inclusion of the great Demon King Piccolo and his son Drum, who Piccolo gives birth to during his ultimate attack, and then Drum proceeds to punch you in the face. Even though most of the Dragon Ball characters are underpowered and would probably go near the bottom of any character tier list aside from you-know-who, they are a fun inclusion and a great homage to the series' origins.
Thanks so much for joining, Hidden, and if you like Dragon Ball related content, make sure to head over and subscribe to Hidden's channel, which I've linked in the description. I think it's pretty clear that the Dragon History mode is one of, if not the most polished story mode of any of the Dragon Ball Z games I've covered so far. It's certainly not as big or comprehensive as its predecessor in Tenkaichi 2, but it does a much better job of making battles feel longer, more impactful, and less repetitive. Like I said earlier, this mode offers quality over quantity. That said, I don't know if I'd say it's better than the story mode in Tenkaichi 2. It's certainly not worse or anything, but they're kind of offering different things to the point where it's almost hard to compare them. It's possible I'd even recommend Tenkaichi 2's story mode over this one to someone depending on what they told me they were looking for. I personally found the focus on less matches overall in favor of making each match longer, more cinematic, with dialogue and multiple characters each match to be a lot less repetitive and more fulfilling to play. There is so much content in this game, and I can tell that the developers wanted to come up with a story mode for it that wasn't just a rehash of what past games had already done. I mean, there's only so many ways you can retell the same series of events while keeping it fresh and interesting. So with that in mind, I have to say, I think this was probably the way to go. Dragon History skips a lot of the fights from the show and manga, but chooses to cover the bigger fights in a bigger way than we've seen before up to this point. And because of that, I think it's still one of the best ways to play through the Dragon Ball story. Introducing Dragon World Tour, the new tournament mode to come with Budokai Tenkaichi 3, and it comes with the most modes and content of any tournament mode we've seen so far. It used to be called the World Martial Arts Tournament mode in previous games, but it's had some pretty ambitious changes made for this one, some for the better and others maybe for the worse. There's 5 separate selectable game types for this mode, 2 of which are brand new, making this the biggest tournament mode of the Tenkaichi series, not counting Sparking Zero since that hasn't been released as of writing this. So the first of these, of course, is the classic, the OG as it were. Can't have a Dragon Ball game without the standard World Martial Arts Tournament mode, and it's the same as it always is. Tried and true, out of bounds is an instant loss, beat your opponent by KO or ring out. You already know what it is, it's a must-have, it works well, and I'm glad it's here. The World Martial Arts Big Tournament is returning after its introduction in the previous game, and it's also pretty much the same as it was before. It's still tournament-based, but set across any of the randomly selected maps in the game without the out-of-bounds aspect, so basically, it's just a set of matches against randomly selected opponents and a tournament format, with the final opponent being the champ himself. The Cell games is a mainstay for DBZ games at this point, and although the mode itself hasn't changed at all, the sheer volume of maps and characters available in Tenkaichi 3 makes this the best instance of it by far. Same as always, the big unique factor of this one is that you carry your health over between matches until you finally face off against Cell himself. One of two brand new tournament type modes is the Otherworld Tournament, which, as far as I can tell, is the same thing as the World Martial Arts Big Tournament, just with a different announcer, and the final fight always being either Super Saiyan 3 Goku or Pikkon. I mean, sure, why not? It's a cool enough idea, and the new announcer can mix things up for people too familiar with the regular tournament modes. The final new addition to the tournament mode is the Yamcha game. This one is really the most interesting, I think, because when players hop into this mode, the character they will be playing as is selected for them at random, and even more, everything is selected at random. The character, which custom iteration, and even the costume itself is all selected for you at random. Other than that, it's just a series of battles against different characters and maps, but the final fight is always against Yamcha. If you complete the mode on its highest difficulty, you can even unlock the character Fasha from the first Bardock film and an extra map. Across all of these offerings, I think it's pretty clear that this is easily the biggest tournament mode we've seen yet, but maybe not the best. There's one really weird thing about this whole mode I need to talk about, and it's that you can't really decide what mode or difficulty to play whenever you want. Well, you can, but you can't. Let me explain. So, there's two versions of the World Tour. One is called, of course, World Tour. The other is simply called Free. The only difference is that the initial option locks the player to only being able to play one single mode on a certain pre-selected difficulty at a time. Even stranger, it seems to pick what mode is available randomly, and it's based on an in-game time mechanic. Certain tournaments are only open at certain times, and the difficulty you'll have access to is also time-locked. I think I can kind of understand what they were going for with this time mechanic, and if it was exciting for you, then I get it, but it just came across as annoying and unnecessarily restrictive to the player, in my opinion. And also, maybe even a little bit pointless, since the free mode allows players to just select and run any of the tournaments they want on any difficulty they want. I think winning a tournament this way won't net you the same rewards as doing it the legitimate way, especially since you can play with friends in the free mode, and that would allow cheesing victory. I don't know, it's an odd inclusion, but I don't think it's awful. Maybe a lot of people thought it was really cool at one point. I just didn't like it personally. But don't worry, because we're not done talking about all of the interesting game modes available here. Budokai Tenkaichi 3 keeps up the tradition of having a unique bonus mode for people to play with, but in this case, we actually get multiple, and one of them is totally unique to this game. The Ultimate Battle Mode is back again, and is the home of this game's various bonus modes, of which there are 3. There is a 4th conditional mode, but we'll get to that. The first of these modes is the most interesting, and it's called Sim Dragon. I'll be honest, my thoughts are pretty conflicted about it, because it's really cool in concept, but doesn't quite pull it off in execution. The game refers to it as a battle simulator, and the player is given a menu where they have 10 turns to best optimize their character before a battle occurs. The game calls each turn a single day, and in those 10 days, you'll have to wisely choose how best to use each day. Your options are to train your attack, defense, or both at the same time. Doing this too much, or even at all really, can risk overtraining you and losing your attack, defense, and health points all at once. This happens seemingly at random, which is a stupid decision because it unfortunately removes a lot of potential strategy and replaces it with a dice roll. The other 3 actions to use your turn are to explore, rest, or take a Senzu Bean. The exploration mechanic is where most of this mode actually takes place. While utilizing one of your turns on this option, the outcome could be one of around a dozen different things based on RNG. These range from things like getting extra points to spend, to mini-games to train your character, and even a way to unlock additional battles in the other Ultimate Battle Mode. I'll talk about that in a second. After the 10 days is up, you fight an opponent, and if you win, you move on to the next level. If you lose, however, it's game over and back to the start. The whole thing is a fun concept, but ends up being a lot more dull and unexciting than it may have sounded. I did like a lot of the potential here, but the RNG training factor was so frustrating a lot of the time, and after 1 or 2 rounds it got so repetitive that I just didn't even want to play it anymore. The fact that you can unlock additional fights for the Mission 100 mode makes it kind of a necessity to play, so you'll have to play through it if you want to play the next mode. Speaking of which, the next mode is the aforementioned Mission 100. We've seen something like this before. It's very much like the Ultimate Battle Z mode from Tenkaichi 2, where you play through a series of battles and each one is themed in some way, just like the ones in the last game. Now, I took the time to go over each of the themed battles in Tenkaichi 2, but I'm not doing that this time. It's just too big to break all of the battles down one by one, there's too many. But that could be worth exploring in its own video if there's any content creators watching looking for a DBZ video idea. Could be fun to go through each of the themes in this mode. It's a lot of fun and makes a great excuse to play with your favorite characters and utilize the character customization tool the game offers. Unfortunately, it suffers from the exact same issue as the previous game's story mode did, and that's just that there's too much of it. These battles start to feel very samey after a while, and it ends up becoming downright exhausting. Cute themes to package the same battles can only go on for so long, you know, and 100 battles is a lot. I will say though that if you love the way the game feels to play, then this mode is a great excuse to do so while also enjoying all of the creative themings the devs came up with for the battles. There is a third mode that has to be unlocked though if you're able to power through 30 of the 100 battles. It's called Survival, and it's what it sounds like. A set of enemies come at you and you have to see how long you can last. After you've cleared out the available enemies, they just reset from the start and keep coming until you either die or quit. Looking at the Bardock level, for example, we see it's multiple of Frieza's minions leading up to fighting Frieza himself, and it just keeps going from there. There's a few different survival levels you can play to really test out your skills, and it's another cool addition that really helps solidify this as the ultimate Dragon Ball Z simulator. Now, for Wii owners, that's where the game basically ends, but for PS2 players, there is a last bit of additional content to unlock, if you own the previous two Tenkaichi games. Tenkaichi 3 introduces a new mechanic called Disc Fusion, which feels like it was a lot of work to implement for such a small reward. Basically, if you use this, it will allow you to eject your Tenkaichi 3 disc and put in either your Tenkaichi 1 or 2 discs. The game will read the data and let you re-enter the third game's disc to several new battles for players to enjoy. The Tenkaichi 2 battles, for instance, are some of the highlights from its own Ultimate Battle mode, whereas the Tenkaichi 1 battles are a redo of the 100 battle list from that game as well. So essentially, it just brings over the two bonus modes from the past two games into this one, which, while a very interesting concept, ends up just being more of the same from Mission 100. Despite that, I do still think it's cool that it rewards players who own the previous games with a little something extra. So that's all the gameplay content for people to play, but how does playing it all feel? Well, I mean, it pretty much plays exactly the same as Tenkaichi 2, but with a few interesting additions to dial in the combat. Neat new moves like Sonic Sway, which is where if you can time two inputs correctly, your character will commence a series of fast dodges against your opponent's attacks, and hit them with a powerful counter. Or, speaking of counters, the Z counter move, which is where if you time your dodge correctly, you seemingly teleport behind your opponent and knock them back. I say seemingly because this is actually just hyper-fast movement, not real teleportation like instant transmission. Another neat inclusion is that of the day and night system. It's not quite what it sounds like. I don't think there's any real-time day and night system since the matches literally do not last long enough for that, but most maps do have multiple versions for daytime, sunset, and evening. Even this small addition adds an enormous amount of variety for a ton of maps. Playing the mountain stage at night feels totally different than playing it during the day, despite being the same map. And it overall makes the battle feel significantly less repetitive overall. And it can even affect gameplay and make applicable characters like Bardock or Gohan transform and become great apes, which is an integrated gameplay mechanic that requires a map where the moon is present to work. Pretty cool. One thing that confused me though is that we still have desolated versions of maps like Namek and Earth, but in all of my hours of playtime, I didn't directly cause a map transition to occur even once. This is strange because I can't imagine why they would remove a mechanic like that, but I didn't ever see it happen. Can someone in the comments confirm for me if map transitions via massive explosions are gone, or if they're just way harder to make happen? With the addition of the multiple light cycles, I can confidently say this is by far the most maps we've seen. Even outside of that, we still have some great new maps like fighting in space on top of Frieza's ship, or even HFIL, which is just hell but censored so the show could go on Toonami. One thing that hasn't been expanded, but rather reduced, is the Evolution Z mode. Yeah, it feels much smaller this time around, and a little less interactive and intuitive, at least to me. You now level up individual characters with points instead of buying a bunch of the same items repeatedly for different characters. So now when you get an item once, you don't have to get it again. But you do have to use quite a few points to level up whatever character you're hoping to use enough to max them out. I see what they were going for here, but what it ended up accomplishing with me is just getting the 2 or 3 items I needed to max out health and give me an edge, and then always just using that without bothering to look at most of the other items in the game. Also, item fusion is just straight up gone, so no more fusing items together for better ones or even to unlock new characters. That minigame has just been totally removed. Now you unlock characters in different ways, mostly through real gameplay. Of course, both the duel mode and the training mode are back, and on the Wii version of the game, you could even play online. A first for the Tenkaichi series, I believe, although it was criticized for having lag. And lastly, another very exciting new feature is that Tenkaichi 3 allows you to save your battles and replay them as videos so you can watch back your performance or even create anime-like fights between characters you'd be excited to see fight it out in the show. So if you run through a battle with a friend, now you can watch it back and cherish those memories remembering the epic battles between you. I love this, although these days it likely won't be used all that much. And that's all of the new gameplay features available for Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3. It's an incredibly dialed-in version of everything the previous 2 games were attempting to achieve, and it's so easy for me to see now why so many consider this to be the greatest Dragon Ball game ever made. I mean, if someone asked me what a love letter to Dragon Ball would look like, I imagine this is about what I would describe. I mean, what else can I say? All of the bonus modes here are bigger than ever, and are sure to satiate even the hungriest Dragon Ball fans. Since not only is there just so much content available here, but also because it has elements from all 3 of the major series from the time. I really do think one of Budokai Tenkaichi 3's biggest strengths is that it manages to have a little something for everyone. Wow, all of this time I've managed to go without playing this game feels shocking to me after having finally taken the time to really pore over it all and sink my teeth into it. That said, this all still feels pretty new to me since I really don't have the same experience with the game that a lot of other fans do. Budokai Tenkaichi 3 really is something else, and since I've never played it until doing so for this coverage, I thought maybe I should reach out to someone who might be able to really elaborate on what makes Budokai Tenkaichi 3 such a special game compared to other DBZ games. With that in mind, I've asked fellow frequent DBZ creator NIOSAI to come in and tell us in his own words what makes Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3 so special.
Tenkaichi 3 is the culmination of nearly everything that came before in the series, but with an even more expanded roster, making it one of the most impressively huge fighting rosters of the era, if not the biggest. One of the biggest highlights for me is this game's very unique and expansive production value compared to previous entries, with loads of in-battle dialogue that elevates a lot of the fights and makes them feel special and climactic every single time. This is even further enhanced in the fantastic what-if scenarios, where there's a wealth of dialogue and character interactions, and while these kinds of interactions are things that basically every modern Dragon Ball game does really well, Tenkaichi 3 really did set the bar for me. And speaking of setting the bar, what's crazy is that it felt like the developers genuinely wanted to make this the pinnacle of Tenkaichi games. And you can see it not only in the incredibly tight and responsive game feel, but also in the inclusion of stuff they didn't even have to do, like multiple times of day and stages, in-battle Great Ape transformations that are tied to the time of day stages, and even the disc fusion mechanic in Ultimate Battle that unlocks modes from the previous games to reward players who supported them. There's also the goofy stuff like the addition of even more World Tournament content. Yamcha game is wacky and dumb, but it's also really fun and it's a unique challenge, since it adds an element of randomness and unpredictability in a game where it's really easy to select your most overpowered characters every single time. This isn't to say that the game is perfect, of course. There are some things that its predecessors do better, like the single-player open map exploration from Tenkaichi 2, but the sum of 3's parts make what is, in my opinion, a much more fulfilling whole than the previous entries. There's just something really magical about Tenkaichi 3, and maybe it's nostalgia, but I don't think any Dragon Ball game has ever really felt the same since, despite most of them being in the same genre with the same gameplay style. Sure, newer Dragon Ball games have even more characters and stages and mechanics, but there was just this perfect balance of tightness and features and presentation, and the uniquely 2000s PS2 era charisma this game evokes every time I boot it up. I could never get tired of this game, and I can't say that about a lot of other games. And really, the Tenkaichi series in general is legendary overall, and I'm sad that it took nearly 2 decades for the series to make a legitimate comeback. But even despite that, there's still a really active community playing this game to this day, and I bet that community will continue playing it even after Sparking Zero is out too. That just goes to show how impactful this game was, and really continues to be.
Thanks for joining me, NIOSAI. I really think that just about sums it all up, right? It's a great game, and in spite of the multitude of other games released since then, it still remains one of the best Dragon Ball experiences available, even now. But before we wrap this one up, there's a few more things we need to talk about. The first of which, of course, is my cover art critique, except I can't really do much of my normal cover art comparison since the differences between all iterations of said cover are so minimal. The first thing you'll notice is that once again the European and Japanese covers are the same except for the logo. So let's just... Okay, so all of the covers feature pretty much the same artwork, with the only real difference being how zoomed in the image is, whether or not Gohan is present, and the placement of the logo itself. By this point, regional cover arts were really fading out of prominence, and so being able to really compare them starts to become a little pointless. But all the same, let's look at what we've got. The US cover art is the least zoomed in, showing more of the characters, and as you can see, totally emphasizing Goku. The big difference about this cover when compared to the EU cover is that the logo is on the top of the art. I actually prefer this. It centralizes Goku in his iconic Kamehameha wave pose, while allowing the logo to pop more by not having as many distractions around it. This isn't the best artwork we've seen, but it does work well. The EU cover, on the other hand, is more zoomed in, and because the logo is below Goku's hands, ends up feeling so much more cluttered that they had to put a massive white outer glow on it to make it even legible. Also, Gohan is here, making the art even busier and more cluttered than it already was. From that alone, I think most of you can pretty quickly guess that I prefer the US artwork to the EU and JP variations. The removal of Gohan makes the cover feel less busy, allowing other characters to breathe and pop more, and the placement of the logo is much better and stands out more without needing the additional white glow. At the end of the day, all of these covers are really similar to one another, but in my opinion, the US one stands out way more in a big way. On to the music, which was once again helmed by the very talented Takanori Arima, returning from the second game score. Now, I'd heard quite a few people say that the score for Tenkaichi 3 didn't quite measure up to the second game, and after spending some time with both games so recently, I'm inclined to agree. Despite having the same composer, the music overall feels less unique this time. It's hard for me to pin down exactly why, especially since multiple of the tracks here actually feel way more complicated and impressive than anything in Tenkaichi 2. I think maybe it's because it all just feels like an instrumental J-rock album, and ends up feeling like it doesn't have a lot of its own identity when compared to the second game's OST. Again, not one song I heard was anything even near what anyone would consider bad. It just feels a bit less unique compared to what came before. A lot of that has to do with the abandonment of breakbeat elements in favor of a more orchestral rock feeling, I think. Although I have to admit that in a lot of ways, this soundtrack feels more authentic to the music we've heard in the series than what the second game had to offer. So with all of the praise you've been hearing about the game, in addition to the incredible reputation it's earned over the years, surely you're all expecting that it was probably reviewed very well on release. Well, surprisingly enough, it somehow holds the exact same Metacritic aggregate as its predecessor. Now, plenty of individual reviewers gave differing scores between the games, but it just so happens that for whatever reason, both Tenkaichi 2 and 3 share the exact same Metacritic scores for both their respective Wii and PS2 iterations, that being a 73 on the PS2 and a 72 on the Wii. What a bizarre coincidence. From what I could gather, most of the criticism was centered around how much more limited the scope of the story mode was when compared to the second game, which, I mean, yeah, I can see that point of view. Personally, I don't really think that just because Tenkaichi 2 had so many more battles to fight that it was better, but I can still understand people feeling a bit disappointed by how much smaller overall the third game was in comparison. Instead of doubling down and refining the story mode, it seems like they simply retracted and altered the design. All in all, I personally think Tenkaichi 3 is just a bit better than 2, if only for the additional gameplay mechanics and expanded roster of both characters and maps to play with. It's kind of like if... Imagine being a 12-year-old kid again, in love with Dragon Ball Z, and someone said to you, "Hey, I've got a box of DBZ action figures here if you want them," and you asked which characters are in there, and they replied, all of them. Every major character, map, fight, and super attack you could reasonably want are all here. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3 is a game made to fulfill that dream. You want to play Tien vs Kid Buu? Got it. What about Kid Piccolo vs Oob? Done. Kid Gohan against Pan? Of course. Super Saiyan 4 Vegeta fighting Broly? Done. What about a multi-character scenario where Mecha Frieza, Metacooler, Perfect Cell, and Babidi all come together and only Goten and Trunks are there to fight them? Sure, why not? And while you could do some of that in past games, not only was the map selection smaller, but you couldn't play it all out and then watch the playback again as if you were making your own episode of DBZ. It's the ultimate Dragon Ball Z game. Budokai Tenkaichi 3 has more maps, more characters, and more possibilities than any other DBZ game I've ever played. Plenty of them reenact events from the series, more still give you more than enough characters to play with, but only this one really gives you the keys to totally unlock your imagination. And because of that, I really can see why of every Dragon Ball game I've ever heard talked about, the one always topping the list has been Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3. Thanks so much to everyone for watching. It was such an exciting endeavor to dig into such a cherished title and talk about it like this. I can only hope I've done some genuine justice by it given how meaningful and important it is to so many people. If you enjoyed the video, I hope you'll consider liking it to help me out in the algorithm, and of course subscribe if you want to stay tuned for more content like this. I've got one more Dragon Ball game to go in this series, and I'm so excited to finish it all off. Quick reminder that members of the channel get exclusive access to a multitude of live stream replays on top of member-only posts, and even early access to certain videos depending on the video. Thanks again everyone for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video, but until then, that's all I've got for you.